Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. Thanks so much for joining us live right here on Facebook for Making the Grade. This is our chance to get caught up on all things education related. And during this pandemic, it has been busier than ever. So joining me live on Facebook is Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News, the group working so hard to keep us informed on all of the craziness going on in our state government, all the way down to what local school districts are dealing with. Kevin, of course, we always want people to chime in and comment, as this has been a quite robust conversation, as it involves everybody as we look toward fall and the school reopening guidelines coming out from the state, we expect this week.
Right. We're expecting the guidelines sometime this week, but if there's any indication that we got from the committee meeting on Monday, this is a very complicated topic, as you would expect. And it seems like every time the committee gets together to talk about it, there are new complications and new issues that emerge. One of the issues that the committee talked about a lot on Monday is school athletics. What do you do with athletics? Is that a complication towards reopening? You had folks talk about whether that really undermines the ability to keep schools open if you have kids going to compete in athletics, competing against other kids from other schools and other school districts. That's yet another question that we're starting to see emerge in this whole dialogue about reopening schools. And let's face it, it's an issue that schools are already dealing with. Our Sammy Edge had a story that we posted earlier today about coronavirus positive test results up in Coeur d'Alene involving student athletes and how that's affected practices and preparation for the fall. Not an isolated incident. We're hearing about that in other districts and other communities. So, we're 6 weeks, 7 weeks away from the start of the school year in most of the state, and there are a lot of unanswered questions at this point.
The state is hoping to give some guidelines to school districts, and we've already heard that Governor Brad Little will be discussing those guidelines, expected to discuss those guidelines during his press conference on Thursday.
Going to be a very interesting presser on Thursday, because not only will he talk about the school reopening guidelines, and again, guidelines, but he's also going to be talking about the state of the coronavirus and where we are in terms of reopening or maintaining businesses being open at a time where we're seeing cases really spiraling, especially here in the Treasure Valley, especially in Ada and Canyon counties. So he's got a lot to talk about on Thursday. There's going to be a lot to listen for when he takes the podium.
Governor Brad Little has said all along, Kevin, that one of his main goals in trying to keep our case numbers down for COVID-19 is to make sure schools can reopen safely in the fall. With numbers spiking, do you expect that tone to change?
I'm going to be very interested in hearing his tone, because you're right. He has 4 weeks maintained that one of his priorities is getting schools open in the fall and back in the spring. He was sounding a pretty optimistic tone about that. He felt at that point there was really nothing that should get in the way of reopening schools in the fall. Well, what we've seen obviously in the past few weeks are some case numbers that have increased sharply in the Treasure Valley, in Kootenai County, in North Idaho. A lot of pockets of sharp increases in coronavirus case numbers. And, like I said, we're only a few weeks out from the beginning of the school year, but those next few weeks are going to be really critical in terms of not only what do the case numbers do in the next few weeks and how does that affect school reopening decisions, but what happens in terms of hospitalization rates. And there are signs that the hospitalization rates are going up. How does that affect any kind of reopening decisions, whether we're talking about businesses or whether we're talking about schools?
All along, the state board has said that the school reopening guidelines will not be a mandate, but rather just guidelines, and school districts themselves will have local control over what happens. Is that true? Will local school districts have all the say?
It's not quite as simple as that. And that's another thing that came out in the meeting on Monday was, yes, school trustees, school administrators will have a say in this, but health districts will still be involved in this conversation. So will mayors. So will the state, the governor's office, and the Department of Health and Welfare. I mean, the state can step in if they feel like there's a situation. The governor talked about this a couple of weeks ago in the context of counties or health districts, but I think it also applies to schools. I mean, the state has a place where it could step in. Health districts have a place where they can step in. Mayors have a place where they can step in. So while I think, a lot of folks in state government would like to turn this decision over to local officials and make this into a local control issue, it's not going to be quite so straightforward. So again, like we've talked about in past weeks, it's going to be really a hodgepodge, and it's really going to be a mishmash of what's happening in school to school and community to community. So something we're really going to have to track closely heading into the start of the school year and then after the year begins.
For example, let's take the Boise School District, right? Right now, Boise, a number of cities, but Boise in particular here, putting out a mask order and making sure that everyone is to be masked in the city of Boise. Does that then apply to the school district?
It's a good question. You would think it would. And I think that's something that school boards and school administrators are going to have to deal with. How do you work within other local guidelines?
I want to bring in some comments here because we have a number of people joining us live on Facebook, and we really appreciate what you have to say about this. This is Sheila, and she's saying, not sure if I'm sending my teen to school or not, considering online. And then there's Jamie here who says, my daughter won't go back to school. Too many cases now, and it's just getting worse. So as parents and perhaps grandparents out there who are debating this issue, I'd love to hear from all of you about how do you figure it out? Like, when do you decide? This is a debate we've been having in our own house. When are too many cases too much? And for each person, it's going to be unique. But Kevin, this is where people are in July, and they're trying to figure out what's happening 6 weeks from now and what that looks like for their work lives.
Take any decision that we're all having to make in our personal lives about what's safe, what we feel comfortable with, and then factor in that you're making that decision on behalf of your kid. I don't envy anybody having to make that decision. I'm a parent. My kids are fully grown. They're making their own decisions, and I can't imagine processing all of this as a parent or as a guardian and having to try to figure out what's the smartest way to go, what's the safest way to go. What do you feel comfortable with? And as we're seeing from the comments this morning, several folks saying what they feel most comfortable with is keeping their kids home and doing online learning. We're going to really closely track what these enrollment numbers look like in the fall, because, this may be anecdotal, but when we see the hard numbers in the fall and we see if there was a major trend towards homeschooling or online learning, that's going to be significant, and it could have a very lasting impact on education in the state.
There are a number of comments coming in, and we're going to continue. Melanie and Edward both joining us online. We appreciate your comments. There's an interesting point there, Kevin. Do you expect in the state guidelines that are coming out, two topics I'd like to talk with you about. One in particular, the state trying to figure out a way to do an online learning module that could possibly be statewide rather than district by district. Would love to hear where that stands, possibly. And the second topic here is liability for schools. So let's start with that online learning module. Do you expect this week that the state board guidelines will be talking about what the state will be doing to support online learning?
It'll be interesting to see, and again, we're only a few weeks out. So whatever the state comes up with in terms of an online module, in terms of an online support model that schools can apply locally, that's going to have to roll out fairly quickly. We're not in this big time crunch quite as much as we were in March when the pandemic first struck, but time is starting to become a limited commodity here. We're only a few weeks out, and school boards and school trustees are having to start to make these decisions right now, because the calendar is turning over now to here we are 1 week into July. Schools are going to start to open that third week in August. It's very limited time frame. You talked about the liability. That's a big topic, and we've discussed this in the past. School officials worried about their liability if they reopen and if there's a case of coronavirus linked to the schools. That's an issue that you could well see the legislature hold a special session to discuss, to give schools some sort of a guidance heading into the school year. Governor Little has left open the possibility of holding a special session to discuss just that topic, or among other topics, but that's one that he has said could be a potential topic for a special session. Something else we're watching closely to see if that comes to pass.
It'll be interesting to see if that gets talked about as well on Thursday during his news conference. I know they're working on it, but what it's going to take to make sure that schools are not held liable, or that they're in this litigious society and community that we tend to live in these days, that what that looks like for school districts as they're battling this.
Lots of questions for the governor these days, and that's yet another one.
Well, and let's talk about Boise State University starting to reopen yet again after over 20 cases linked to the university. They've allowed some employees to come back on campus. They're trying to reopen for fall, and there are questions surrounding trying to test every student who's going to live on campus.
Right. So this limited reopening, I mean, it's a glimmer of good news in terms of, Boise State trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But 7 weeks away from the start of the academic year, 7 weeks away from the university hoping to have students come back to dorms, come back to Boise. The university wants to test students before they go into the residence halls. That makes sense. But there's a question then beyond that of what kind of testing capacity is available, how much testing would be available for staff. That whole testing question has been a big issue throughout this pandemic, and it seems to be resurfacing as an issue again here this summer as the cases begin to spike in the Treasure Valley, as they're, as we're seeing more cases, as we're seeing more concern about cases and community spread in Ada County and Canyon County. Tests are now becoming more limited. So this is a big challenge for Boise State. How much testing capacity will they have available to them? We'll watch and see about that.
And let's face it, as we have said since March, since the pandemic hit, what happens with health is tied to the economy. And we saw that right on Boise State's campus with programs in sports already being cut in order to try and make up some of the budget deficit. And what's to come if students come back to campus, or if the campus has to shut down again? Health is all tied to the economy when it comes to higher education.
Health is tied to the economy. Enrollment has a big economic tie-in. I mean, how many students do return to Boise State? How many students are back in Boise, not just living on campus, but they're going to grocery stores, to stock up their dorm rooms or stock up their apartments. There are so many economic impacts that enrollment and in-person enrollment is going to have. So yet another reason to watch what happens at Boise State and the other colleges in the weeks to come.
I want to bring in this comment from Ryan. She's saying, I'm worried that there's going to be too much. Maybe they go, maybe they won't. She's talking about going back to schools here. I'm not comfortable with wishy-washy status. Very interesting terminology there, because I think a lot of us figure it is very wishy-washy out there. I believe there needs to be consistency, she says. So I'm hoping they will just say distance learning again from home until the virus clears up. And that's the point of the state guidelines, right? Is to not be so wishy-washy.
But yet leave this decision as much as possible to local officials. So what happens at the local level may be very, very different from community to community and could change very quickly. I mean, what may seem wishy-washy, and I understand, the sentiment behind that comment, what may seem wishy-washy may also be a school board or a school administrator saying, my goodness, this thing is really changing on us, and the community reality is changing really quickly. We've got to move fairly quickly, as we've seen local officials trying to do with what you've seen with several cities coming up with mask directives, requirements for people to wear masks in public, having to act quickly and in the moment to respond. I suspect we're going to see schools having to do that, no matter what is decided on here in these next few weeks. I think what unfolds in the fall, it could require school districts to make very quick decisions.
And I hope this doesn't come across as flippant to anybody, but it used to be hard to decide whether or not to take a snow day, right? Like, this is obviously an entirely new world we're living in, and school districts are going to have to give parents the opportunity to be flexible as well. I know many districts are doing online plans and putting those out, but as you said, Kevin, are parents going to have the ability to make changes when certain numbers of cases hit in their community? It has to be not only local control of districts, but parental control as well.
Right. I mean, think of how this affected households and household upon household all across the state this spring. Parents and guardians having to make very quick adjustments to the reality of their kids being at home. Those kind of quick adjustments may have to be made again this fall, depending on what happens with community spread, with case numbers. So, I sympathize with everybody in this situation. I mean, parents and guardians are going to be in a really difficult situation, trying to know what to expect going forward. School administrators are going to be in a very difficult situation, trying to figure out how to respond. We're all facing the unknown here, and there's no guidebook. There's no manual here that we can fall back on. So, we'll see what the state board guidelines suggest or recommend. But again, it's going to be a real-time decision, and it's going to be a lot of variation in those decisions from school to school, from community to community.
And for every little thing, Kathy's saying here, transportation, classroom, lunchroom safety. She's talking about online schooling, making sure that the districts don't have that liability. Mm-hmm. Kenny's making the point, quick decisions make quick mistakes. Okay, possibly so, but quick decisions may have to be made as they were back in March. So I just think that this is going to be obviously an unprecedented time for every single household, as you said, Kevin, and hopefully state guidelines that come out later this week will at least, make the situation not quite so wishy-washy, as we could say. Let me take you to another subject, because you wrote about something else that I want to make sure people are up to date on, and we will continue this conversation about school reopening and the guidelines. So continue your comments on that. But let's drop the bombshell that Idaho ranks 51st in the nation on yet another topic in education. Talk to me about per pupil spending in Idaho and how Idaho is dead last.
Right. So these numbers aren't necessarily new. And if you scroll down, we have a new improved version of the story on the website where I have a map that shows state by state where per pupil spending stacks up. Idaho does rank dead last in the nation in per pupil spending. That's not new. National Education Association rankings in past years have come up with similar findings for Idaho. It comes to about $6,800 per pupil that we spent. There we are. Now we get the map. 6747 was the exact figure for Idaho per pupil spending in 2018, 2019. That's exactly $500 per student less than what Utah spends. Utah is number 50 in the list right there. The national average is close to $13,000. So Idaho is spending barely half of the national average in per pupil spending. Again, we've been here before. These rankings historically, whether it's National Education Association doing the rankings or the U.S. Census Bureau doing the rankings, Idaho and Utah seem to flip-flop in that 50th, 51st ranking. Why are we saying 51? Well, we were counting the District of Columbia. So 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Not surprisingly, the Idaho Education Association, the affiliate of the National Education Association here in the Gem State, criticizing the state's spending commitment, saying this is just got to change. We've got to do better for our kids. And that ranking, what I find interesting about where we are, that we're still 51st in the nation in per pupil spending, it comes after several years of fairly significant increases in state funding. several years where the state added $100 million a year to the K-12 budget. Even this year, the state added almost $80 million to the K-12 budget for this current budget year. Now, whether that money materializes or not is really up in the air, because Governor Little has already told school officials to brace for budget cuts in this new year, $99 million worth of budget cuts because of the downturn driven by the coronavirus. So the increases, the gains that the legislature put into the K-12 budget last spring may not materialize. So, even after several years of putting money into K-12, specifically putting money into teacher salaries, Idaho's rankings have not budged in terms of per pupil spending. We've moved it up a little bit in terms of teacher pay, but that is pretty much on hold now with the budget cuts that are going to be imposed because of the downturn. So some fairly sobering news in terms of K-12 spending.
Kevin, Nick asks a really good question here. He says, are these numbers adjusted for cost of living through different areas of the country? Because he's right. Obviously, it costs way more to live in certain areas of California, or you pick it, New York, wherever you want to pick the place. So in order to make sure that you can keep qualified teachers in high cost living areas, are those numbers adjusted for that?
No, these are raw numbers and they're not adjusted for cost of living. That's an excellent point. So, comparing Idaho and New York, it's going to be kind of it's not going to be an ideal comparison, because cost of living in New York is a whole different ballgame than cost of living in Idaho. But you look at some of our surrounding states, though. You look at Wyoming, per pupil spending is about $16,000. So it's more than twice as much as Idaho is spending per student. So that's an interesting comparison to me, because cost of living in Wyoming is not going to be measurably that different than cost of living in Idaho. Now, Wyoming is in a different budget situation, as is North Dakota, as we scroll up to there. These are states with rich natural resources, oil and gas, and that really drives what these states have available to spend in K-12, or really in anything, in any function of state government. So, the comparisons with these other Western states maybe are a little bit more valid than, trying to compare what we spend here to states on the Eastern Seaboard.
You were seeing there Washington spending $15,000 per pupil. The interesting point here for Washington in particular, of course, is how many teachers up north who actually live or work in, live in Idaho and go and teach in Washington, that we lose so many qualified teachers going across the border because they're going to make more money. And that per pupil spending goes directly, a lot of that money, to teacher salaries. So you can really see there, Kevin, where the problem is.
Right. And Washington is a really interesting case study that I know just enough about to be dangerous. But Washington's really an interesting case study for a couple of reasons. They've had a protracted lawsuit about school funding in that state, similar to what we've seen in Idaho with litigation about school funding. So that's affected what Washington is putting into K-12 and what they're putting into salaries. And you're absolutely right. What they're doing in terms of teacher salaries along that eastern part of Washington that borders North Idaho is going to have a real impact on teacher retention in North Idaho. The other thing I'd really be curious about Washington is, how does that per pupil spending vary from Eastern Washington to the Seattle area? How much variation is there in per pupil spending within that state? So, again, to Nick's comments and points, state by state data, it's not an exact measure and it's not a clean measure. It doesn't, there are variations within states, and certainly there are variations between states when you get to cost of living. So, this doesn't answer all of our questions, but these numbers are still, they're interesting and they're telling, and they're something we track year to year.
I find them fascinating. You and I tend to like lists as it is. So it's just a fascinating list. I want to move on to one other topic before we circle back around to what could be presented to the state on Thursday, which is the school reopening guidelines. But before we get there, I want to touch on one other topic we're closely following here on Making the Grade. And again, we appreciate all of your live Facebook comments. We love hearing from you and your thoughts and perspective. This is a topic that we've been talking about for a couple of months now, and then it kind of went away and now it's back, and that's Reclaim Idaho. This is the $110 million K through 12 funding initiative that Reclaim Idaho is trying to get on the ballot in order to make sure that there is more funding for public education through taxing those people making over $250,000 and corporation taxes. Mm-hmm. Where do we stand? Because it is now all caught up in a lawsuit, whereas Reclaim Idaho really wants to get to voters immediately to try and get electronic signatures to get this issue on the ballot.
This has become a daily story. It feels like every day we have a new court development. Where we stand now in a nutshell is this. U.S. District Judge Lynn Windmill has sided with Reclaim Idaho and has said that the state needs to work with Reclaim Idaho and allow the group to begin electronic signature gathering to give them a shot at putting this initiative on the ballot. Give them this 48-day window to do electronic signature gathering, try to collect the remaining signatures that are required to get this initiative on the ballot. The clock is ticking. Judge Windmill's order says that the state needs to work with Reclaim Idaho and come up with a plan to begin this electronic signature gathering process by this week. The state has gone to the higher court, now the Circuit Court of Appeals, and asked the court to put this order on hold. Not surprisingly, Reclaim Idaho is opposing that move. So now we've moved into the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and there are really two questions before the Ninth Circuit. The question of, does this court agree with Judge Windmill that the state violated Reclaim Idaho's First Amendment rights by essentially not working with the group to continue the signature gathering process in the middle of the pandemic? That's the constitutional question. That's the First Amendment question. But the more timely question is, does the circuit court agree with the district court that the state needs to work with Reclaim Idaho and begin the signature gathering process this week? That's the next big development in this case that we're going to be watching for. And I believe the deadline, as I'm recalling my dates here, Thursday is the date that Judge Windmill has said that the signature gathering process needs to begin by. So the clock is ticking. So, that's our story for Monday. I'm sure we're going to have more as the week goes on, because this is a very fast moving case, because, we are 4 months away from Election Day. If this is going to be on the ballot, the signature gathering process has to begin fairly quickly. So, we're going to wait and see what the circuit court has to say.
And of course, if you'd like to follow all of the developments for Reclaim Idaho, idahoednews.org is the place to go. Excellent reporting that they've kept on top of with all the developments that happen. And yes, you're correct, Kevin. Thursday is the day for those signatures, supposedly, to be able to start electronically. We'll see if that happens. Let me take us back one real quick little note. I had an interesting comment here from Brett Young, and it goes back to the per pupil spending that we were talking about, and how much money is raised specifically from running bonds, but more so levies, that what we're talking about. And he's asking, do you know how many districts are running bonds and levies to stay afloat? And Idaho Ed News has done an incredible job of monitoring how many of our districts have to run levies in particular to make sure that they have enough money to keep their budgets going. And I don't know if you have those numbers off the top of your head, Kevin, but this also leads into a quick little discussion for us that there will be levies on the ballot in August, including for the state's largest school district.
Right. So to answer Brett's question, off the top of my head, I want to say that 93 of 115 school districts have supplemental levies. And those are the ones we're talking about in terms of day-to-day operations, because bond issues, those are long-term, that's long-term debt to build schools and to maintain schools. So a little bit of a difference, but the supplemental levies, which is really kind of the crux of this whole conversation about day-to-day school funding, I want to say 93 school districts out of 115. It's certainly more than 90. It varies,
It changes.
1 or 2 districts a year. And we are now in excess of $200 million a year that school districts are collecting from these supplemental levies. They are voter approved. And you alluded to, we've got elections coming up in August on a couple of supplemental levies in this part of the state. They're voter approved. They run for 1 to 2 years. And a lot of school districts have added supplemental levies over the past 10, 12 years, saying that it's needed to kind of backfill and make up for funding that isn't coming from the state. And it's being used, really on day-to-day operations for teacher salaries, for hiring teachers, for keeping teachers in the classroom, for covering the cost of employee benefits. So that's the big picture. That's the statewide picture. And, the question is right on point. Districts are relying on these levies more than ever. And, fast forward to August, West Ada is going to take another run at its supplemental levy, 2 years, $28 million. The Middleton School District decided last week that it will do the same. It will run its 2-year, $3 million supplemental levy. That will be on the ballot in late August. So, those are 2 districts. They tried their supplemental levies during the primary, did not get the majority support that they needed, going back to voters again.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Making the Grade. Want to circle back around in case you've just joined us here at 11:30. Our topics of conversation have ranged all over the place, and you can go back and listen to our
comments. There are a lot of them.
Entire interview here. But let's quickly reassess. School reopening guidelines from the state of Idaho are expected out this week for school districts. Governor Brad Little planning a news conference for Thursday, which we will carry live right here to talk specifically about those school reopening guidelines and what's to come this fall. And as we continue to get comments in from people, again, Kevin, as you can imagine, it is all over the board. Adriana saying, I plan on sending my kids to school until told otherwise. I'm really eager to see how things will change for Valley View District. Many schools will be less crowded. Interesting point, maybe because parents are homeschooling. And then Shelley brings us this comment. Yeah. I plan on sending mine to school as well. I will even sign a waiver stating that the school will not be held responsible if my child gets sick. And we've talked again and again about the liability issue here and what the legislature may have to do in law to make sure that our school districts are protected. Right. Interesting that she brings up.
We're going to watch and see what happens here in Idaho. This has come up in other states already. So yes, the liability issue. That may be something that the governor addresses on Thursday, or he may be asked about on Thursday.
I'm sure if you're there, he will be asked. I have no doubt.
Like I say, we've got a lot of questions for him, and I don't think that we're alone. I think a lot of reporters, we've got a lot to ask the governor about. It's been, not being flippant here, it's been a very eventful couple of weeks, and the case numbers obviously have spiked. The governor has already addressed concern, alarm about the increase in the case numbers. So there's a lot that we'll have to ask about the case numbers, how that affects business reopening, and especially how does that affect school reopening issues, because that's our specialty.
That is our specialty. I didn't even ask you before we went on the air. Are you wearing some unique socks today? I know you have your mask handy because you're in Boise right now, and you need to be masked up, my friend.
Keep my mask up.
Yes.
Even gets my socks even get a little thing now. Okay, so for no particular reason except that I'm feeling sentimental about New York, and if you can get there's a Statue of Liberty around here somewhere, isn't there? We're getting there, maybe.
I certainly see an airplane, and I haven't been on one of those in a really long time.
There is a Statue of Liberty someplace there. Am I getting warmer? It's in there somewhere. Oh, it's on the other side. Okay, we're getting there. This is live. This is not working very well, but I'm working on it. Here, let's try this. We're getting there. There's the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, that's better.
There it is, upside down.
That's better. Well, okay. Parents, it's our one moment of levity here on Making the Grade, because if we are all homeschooling, remote learning, online learning with our children, you can expect us to be here with you, and at least the kids can come watch the socks at the end.
Right. And we obviously, we spent a half hour talking about some very serious issues, and
yes.
and
Yes.
tough decisions for educators and parents. So trying to lighten the mood here a little bit at the end.
Which is what we've always tried to do. So if you want to go back and watch Making the Grades since March, we've had our sock segment. So Kevin, I appreciate you for being the reporter you are, and more importantly, the human that you are.
Thank you. You too. This is always fun, and it's always good to help people get caught up here.
Making the Grade, everybody. If you want to see any of these stories that we've talked about, head to idahoednews.org. I highly encourage you to read their work right now. They're putting out some fantastic information. And of course, we will both be covering the governor's news conference on Thursday.
Right.
And we'll have updates for you then.
It's noon on Thursday if you're wanting to, so noon on Thursday, and then you guys are going to be airing it, and we will be there.
That sounds great. Thanks for joining us for Making the Grade, everybody. We appreciate your comments and questions. Stay safe.